Well, this week we're looking at social and interpersonal development. Part of this includes social and emotional development. You'll get a lot from your textbook chapter, and please have a look at the study notes where we talk about this and what you can read in the chapter. We emphasise different points that are important for you. In this brief lecture, we'll be talking about friendships and then some strategies for supporting students. But one of the things that I think is a really important point, while we might teach our subject area, so we might be a primary teacher, or we might be a physics teacher, or we might be visiting LOTE teacher, we all teach our curriculum, of course. But we do know from our earlier work the critical importance of well-being for students. So this is fundamentally part of our job. This issue is not just for school children, and it's not just for the kids that we're going to teach in the future. One of the things that we do know is that at university level, it can be possibly a very lonely place for many students, and for many of us at various times have felt this way. So you might think about, did you know others when you started at uni? If you've come with a great cohort from your high school, it's easier to settle in. For students who've come from the country, or they've moved states to be here, or even if they've come from small schools or they're in a course where none of the other students are, it can be very hard at first. And certainly we try at UQ to engage students early on. Well, this might be a struggle for us all at this time, because we certainly are forced into a virtual way. And one of the things we know with secondary and primary students is that they've been missing their friends. But we're also feeling, and I know staff, we're feeling that we're missing our friends. Even though we see them on the other end of a computer, it's not the same. And it's no doubt challenging for you as well. Don't suffer in silence. Please, if you need help or if you're looking for some support, don't forget that the Student Services team are always there, as well as your teaching team for this course. So sometimes we see others who seem lonely, and when we're all back together, you might want to keep your eye out. A lot of students you can see buried into their phones. That's a sort of a more modern way that people can show, I guess, that they're, well, not show really, that they are lost and alone. But here's a photo. The gentleman in the photo is Dr. John Cotton. He was a chemistry lecturer here and taught me years and years ago. And the other ladies in that photo were with me in that very first year chemistry course. We're good friends to this day, and one of the, I guess, interesting point was that in that first semester each one of us had felt lost and alone, and one of my friends was even at the point of dropping out, until we managed to find each other, and we're glad that we did. So keeping contact and keeping connected is a really big issue. We know it is the case in tertiary, and it's particularly the case in schools, though we don't necessarily see it perhaps as obviously. I'll leave you to pause and read through these lists of social skills and emotional skills, and then also what they help to do. These things are important. Again, you can pause and you can read through these. I think some of the important ones here: providing resilience against bullying. If you've got good social skills, it doesn't protect you from bullies, but what it does is it helps you deal with it, and it helps in overcoming some of the negative impacts. So what are some of the issues? If we have a look at that one, if we're thinking about students with disability, some of the issues here are around peer social interactions. And so the greater your disability, the greater it can be that you lose your opportunities to engage with peers. One of the sad things in the literature is that many students with disability are lonely and report that they don't have friends. And in the adult literature, many of the adults talk about their friends as people who are paid carers. Friends are important because they help with social and emotional development. And loneliness is an issue. Remember, there's a difference between being alone and lonely. So I remember my son when he was in year 1 or 2, they had to do reflective writing. So home came a little piece in his journal where he'd written and drew a picture of himself, and he said, "Today at lunchtime I sat under a tree by myself and had a bit of peace." So it's not that we will need to recognise that every child sitting by themselves is lonely. Sometimes that's where they want to be, but I think we also need to see it as a factor to be alert to, because sometimes people become habituated to that way of being, and maybe they'd prefer not to have been from the start. So relationship vacuum creates a vulnerability. What's meant by that is that if you don't have friends, if you're feeling lonely, you're then vulnerable to a whole range of things. You can be vulnerable to bullying, to adopting inappropriate behaviours to try to fit in. You've got nobody to bounce ideas off, so if things aren't going too well for you, then you've got nobody to talk through those things with. Now, one of the challenges that we see in inclusive classrooms that have a lot of teacher aid support is that you'll often have the young person having adults around them all the time, and that's not good, particularly at lunchtime. They need to have some space, and they need to be just with peers. But you can't avoid it. On the weekend, I was picking my daughter up from a camp, and they were all in their 20s and 30s, and in the car park to pick them up at the end of the camp were all their parents. Now, that wouldn't happen in a circumstance where they didn't have disabilities, I would think, because mostly they'd be driving or they'd have friends to take them. And so it's a fact of life, but it is also something we should recognise and try to make other options available. So peers, you can read through those things. You can also think about what have your peers given for you. And one of the things I think in the midst of this, allowing practicing social skills, but also we learn about, I guess, our own culture and the things that matter. You know, you hear about what people are watching, what apps they're using, and how they're engaging in the world. Well, there were some of the points around the importance of social and emotional development, and as I said, there's more in the textbook and there's references there to take your reading and thinking further. I'll now do a little touch on friendship, because as we've already mentioned, this is a really important aspect. Friendships are important. It's one of the things about humans. We are social beings, and a friendship is something that's a voluntary relationship, so you can't force a friendship, and you've got the opportunity, though, if it's reciprocal, people enjoy each other's company, and then there's a lot to be gained from it. And you can read the quote there from Jane Clapton, who was an ethicist working at Griffith University, recently retired. But that's, I think, a beautiful quote of why friendship is an important part, and that's captured on the community resource unit website, and you can find some strategies there about how to help people make friends and also why they're important. I'll leave you to read through these at your leisure and have a think about them. Then you can stop it and pause and think about what your experience is and what strategies can you use to help. And you know, when we're thinking early adolescence, we're thinking late primary school, maybe into the secondary school. And so they're contexts where you'll probably want to think about and be ready. You no doubt have seen some of the issues unpack. When we move into late adolescence, so it's in the upper area in the high school, these issues are really, I suppose, an indication that our social and emotional development continues into adulthood. So it's also where our friendships move as well. Okay, so where students spend their time is where they're going to develop their friendships. So friendships are more likely to develop if students are regularly and often in the same place. So if you've got somebody that you expect to see in that same space, then you're going to have a chance to get to know them and get to like them. And one of the challenges my friends and I were reminiscing about that I mentioned earlier in this lecture was that we were studying science and there were a few hundred students in any lecture. We would rarely see the same people twice. We would often be in different lab classes so you just would not see the same person, and that's when it becomes very difficult to make friends. We need to think about that in the school. So students need to spend time with other students, and so if you've got students who get taken off to the library at lunchtime because that's where the teacher aides are, or that's where they can be supervised, or they go off to the special ed unit and nobody else can get in there, then they're going to feel very much isolated and will find it very hard to find friends. So we need to think about how we can get them to be involved. So I'll leave you to have a look at these points, and you can think about these when you are in prac contexts and thinking about what the teachers can do. So finally, we're thinking about some strategies. So what do peers say in how to include? You can read through some of those suggestions. I like that one, don't let students make fun of them when these are the students, but I think that's a really important one, that we must model the appreciation, and that if somebody is making fun of them, don't call them out in front of the whole class, because that gives them an audience. Just go up to them quietly and engage them at an adult to adult type thing, even though they're not adults, but just very quietly say something along the lines of, tell me what you're doing. Would you like to be treated like that? And sometimes when a person is just quietly being called on it, then that makes them stand back and think, what am I doing here? So we need to think about some ways to really act on that and make sure that it doesn't become something that's really common. You can read through those other points they make. I think they make good reading. In a classroom, we need to do certain things to help our young people fit in, and some strategies around social and emotional development. Now I want you to look at the photo on the left. This is a photo from a classroom where I was doing a research study, and it struck me, see all the little children there with their hands on their heads? That is an explicit behaviour that is taught in some classrooms. So when children are required to be quiet and listen, the teacher asks them to put their hands on their heads. It's certainly a way of stopping them from fidgeting or
annoying the kid next to them, but it's also a way of indicating paying attention. But this is not standard social behaviour. So children, particularly children with intellectual disability or children who are new to the culture, have to learn what that is all about. They've got to be explicitly taught. The photo on the right is from another classroom, and you can see there's a boy with Down syndrome, and he is sitting beside a peer, and the peer is able to engage in the lesson, and our student there with Down syndrome could be completely off the point, but he is then having that opportunity to see what a peer does and to see what he should be doing. So those peer interactions are really powerful and can save you as the teacher a lot of work. In terms of classroom support, we need to minimise hovering adults. So we need to let kids do things and be ready to support them, but not over support. So remember what we've talked about with teacher aides, they're not attached to the student. But now outside the classroom, this is where we really need to directly involve peers. And there's a video clip there that you can watch of a student with severe and multiple disabilities, unable to communicate directly, but uses a communication book. And his friends show how they involve and are interacting. And the interesting thing, I think, in the book, they got to choose the words, some of the words that could be put in that book. And the interesting thing was that they wanted to include swear words, and the teachers found that confronting. They weren't sure what way to go with it, but then they reconciled it by thinking, well, if we weren't around out there in the playground, that's the way they speak. So why shouldn't he have the opportunity to use those words should he wish? So I think that's an indication of why it's important to remember that we need to keep out of these friendship groups if possible. So here's a photo of, you can imagine what SEU might stand for, the Special Education Unit, and the door is closed. Many students who are in those units spend their lunch times there. So is it inclusive or exclusive? Well, we could think about if the doors were left open, people could come in, but often children don't know, or older students don't know they're invited in. And sometimes kids can formally invite others in, but it doesn't automatically say everybody's welcome. So what we can do is work with families, so we can have intentional engagement of peers. And an example was Jan Kruger, who is the Imagine More is the group she founded, and she talked of how she invited peers of her son wanted to invite. So she explicitly planned a time that she would invite them in. She sent out invitations, they provided pizzas, and she talked about the role of peer supporter. And so her son chose them, and then if these other children, young people responded and wanted to be a peer support, then that was a formal position. So it initially was a formal thing, and then it allowed opportunities for friendships to develop, and that continued afterwards, even after the student had left the school. There are many resources for teaching social skills, and I encourage you to look for them. Remember your resource collection while it's over and done with. You can still keep working on it. Strategies to increase social interactions. There is a list there, and you can read through that. Remember that friends shouldn't always have to be the teacher, so you can leave that to peers, but you also need to keep your eye on it.
Well, that's the main ideas that we've been looking at in this lecture, this is a very important area of our work, and it really is the work of every teacher to think about the social and interpersonal development of our students. It really matters to their quality of life and their well-being. And as we've learned earlier in the course, that has flow-on effects into their educational outcomes. So it's not something we can ignore. It really is something that we can deal with. It is something that there are resources to support us. It's not something that we can ignore or think that we can leave it to someone else. So I encourage you to gather up your resource collection. If you're allocated to a form class or a tutor group, whatever it's called in individual schools, take on that job with relish. Really enjoy it. Don't just use it as the time to mark the roll and read out the notices. Get to know the students and focus in on this particularly important aspect of their learning.